starting our little YouTube video today.
It's actually illegal.
Let me kind of break down how things are going to go. It's 100% guaranteed, it looks like, that we will not have another exam before the grading period is over, at least a big exam. I was told, though, that next Friday is a period now, that we were supposed to have it off, but now we no longer have it off. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because
the administration.
Because of the hurricane.
They said we weren't going to have any days.
You guys missed a full week because of the hurricane, and we are at least a week behind schedule in here. So we'll see how it plays out. There is a chance, though, that we might be doing something on Friday that would be grade-worthy. So whatever it is, I'll get ahead of it for you. The next few days, though, we're going to be going over imperialism, and then rather than doing like a Sunday afternoon, which was what I had originally planned, I'll give you like some kind of video assignment, we'll just call it that, and then we'll pick up what we need to pick up next week. But we will be done with material by Wednesday of next week, even though we haven't even started yet. That's kind of how it's going to go. All right. This unit's pretty familiar to most of you, other than this stuff that we're going to be doing the next few days, which is imperialism. Then there's a whole chunk of World War I. And I think most of you at least have a working knowledge of World War I and how it started and who the players were, et cetera, et cetera. And you probably have working knowledge of the Versailles Conference that followed it. So that should be review in a lot of cases to you. That means that you really, really want to pay attention to this stuff, which is probably not as known, and then the Russian Revolution, which is something that we will have to deal with next week. So, we won't get to the notes towards like about 10, 15 minutes in, but I want to show you where they are at the very least. So we're in Unit 8 now. We're getting towards the end. And if you go to notes, yes, I know, cheers. It makes me feel good. Instead of, oh, it's almost over, it's, yes.
You know what? I like
It's all good, man.
like
I don't need it. All right. So this one is called AP Chapter 26. It's actually 24 now. Notes Part 1. And we are going to talk about what I call the no soup for you countries. But we're going to look at how imperialism kind of gets its gears going. And it really, you're looking at some areas that used to be completely off limits as far as European incursions were concerned. And the two that were the most prominent were Japan and China. And then the third is going to be Egypt, which was just like a vassalage, if you will, of the Ottoman Empire. And we're going to see that Europe takes about three different approaches to imperializing all three of those states. And that's on top of everything else. If you look on the board here, I wanted to make sure that you were clear about this distinction, because sometimes this is called new imperialism. The so-called age of imperialism is sometimes referenced as new imperialism, which would mean that there's an old imperialism. Now, what was the old imperialism?
America.
Do people just like randomly shout stuff out?
America.
What would the old imperialism be? It's stuff we've already studied. And what would the time period be?
1500.
All right, even before that.
The Italian and like
Roman.
Further.
Roman.
Just conquering.
Sometimes we call it the age of exploration. Good. Yes.
That's what I meant.
And who started that?
Columbus.
Portugal, not Columbus. Okay, that's all right. We're playing. 1450 to 1650 is often characterized as old imperialism. Sometimes it's called the age of exploration. Portugal, Spain, eventually the Dutch, and then later to the game, the French and the English. But for the most part, if there was empire building, it was done in the Americas. There was obviously a lot of trade posts, et cetera, along coastal Africa. There was one decent colony. Where was it? In Africa. South. What was it called? Close. Cape Colony. All right, and it was under Dutch control until the English wrestled it away when the English started taking everybody else's stuff. And then India, to some extent, or at least the India companies economically controlling India, and then some of the territories along what we call the East Indies. All right, so, and we know what that was, and the kind of questions you might get. These are very, very typical AP Euro questions. Would be a compare and contrast between the so-called old imperialism and the new. The new the time period is, sometimes they say 1870 to 1914. I would say that it's probably closer to 1850 to 1914. It really does kind of step on the gas around 1870 though. All right? And the new imperialism, the leaders are going to be France and Britain, Germany post-Bismarck, and then we add some new players to the game, including Japan, which was imperialized at one time, but quickly turned and became imperializers, and then the good old US&A, all right, that also played that role around the turn of the century. And to a lesser extent, Spain was there. Belgium, had one thing. They mastered atrocity. I mean, they way ahead of the Holocaust. All right. King Leopold II of Belgium was able to Holocaust times 4 in Central Africa around the turn of the century. Yeah.
Who had imperialized Japan?
I'm going to get to that. Okay. I wouldn't say that it is imperialized, but it was, to a lesser extent, its markets were pried open against its will. Okay, so we will get to that. But no, it's not going to be conquered, all right, in the traditional sense, the way that like the entire African continent will be, and a lot of territories in Asia. Okay. All right, hey, the first part of the reading, though, and this was what I assigned to you guys yesterday, and I'm sure you all jumped all over it and read it and nourished it. The first section is called Industrialization in the World Economy, and what it does is it gives you an explanation to kind of look and see the world as it situates in the mid to late 19th century and what is new, and helps provide some kind of logical explanation for why Europe did what it did, which is to get out there and start conquering these territories. And so there's a logic to it. It's the same logic that we would have seen from like the mercantilist era, when France and Britain and others were running around the world trying to compete for colonies. When you become an advanced industrialized country and you start kicking out a lot of product and you're getting used to building your GDP and all of those things, and there was transformative financial gain from the Industrial Revolution from a lot of different places. Okay? But remember when we had the conversation about continental industrialization and talked about the fact that as other countries began to industrialize, they had to protect their industries. Because if they allowed British goods or people that had been doing it better than them to flood their markets, then they wouldn't be solvent. All right? And so what Britain would ultimately face is, even though they want to be the free traders, because they have an obvious advantage in any kind of trade relationship that they would develop in the 19th century. France and Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands and Italy and some of these other places, it's going to take a while for them to be able to get their bearings before they could ever think about becoming free traders. So Britain is sitting on steel production and coal production and iron production and textile production, and they're making so much stuff. But they're also noticing that there's tariff barriers that are put up in a lot of their traditional trading partners, which frustrates their ability to be able to maximize profit. The logic of that would indicate you expand. In the same way when we looked at mercantilism, the best thing that you could possibly do is find territories that can't erect tariffs against you because you control them. All right? And expand to other areas, because what do colonies offer, or what do other areas offer that maybe some of these established European states do not? There's really three major things. What's the first one? Raw materials. Okay? And back in the day, it might have been things like spices, or it might have been things like gold and silver. These were things that maybe they didn't have in abundance, but the areas that they took control of did. Okay? And then eventually it's cotton, or it's tobacco, or it's other things that they're able to use for like raw materials for manufacture, and then they can turn around with their finished products and look to trade or to sell. Okay, so that's number one. Raw materials or natural resources. And you'll notice, like, the Industrial Revolution is changing. All right, with the advent of internal combustion engines, that means that petroleum is going to be a new get. All right, rubber plantations are going to be huge because of the need for imported rubber. Okay, and a lot of these areas, I mean, these are things that you're not going to find a lot of rubber plantations in Scotland. You know, I mean, they've got to exist someplace else. All right? So that's the raw material end. That's something that cheap, readily available raw materials that they can use and ultimately transform into industrialized products. What else? Thank you. Okay, cheap labor, as it has always been. But think about the timing of it. The apex of the age of imperialism is the 1870s, 80s, 90s. What's taking place in Western Europe in the more advanced industrialized states? Okay, abolition of slavery, followed by the increase of suffrage to include the working class, followed by working class revolutions, followed by Marxist sympathies, followed by evolutionary or ballot socialist sympathies, followed by the formation of labor unions, followed by increased wages, followed by accident insurance and a variety of other things, right? The working class is doing really well in Europe. They're getting louder, they're getting a voice, they're getting their sort of slice of the pie. Isn't it cute that right around the time that happens, and that might seep into capitalist profit margin, is the point when they start expanding to Africa and Asia and the so-called third world? Where they can virtually duplicate slave labor, but do it in a different geographical space. Okay? Is it surprising then that Christian missionaries are going to follow everybody into Asia and into the heart of Africa looking to convert all of the souls to Christianity? That serves two purposes. One, the post-Darwinian Europe is post-religious, so they're losing a lot of converts, which means they're losing money. All right. The second thing is, though, if you buy any of the Marxian talk, religion has a way of pacifying people. Okay? So maybe that exploitation, you can find some way of detracting from the here and now and that social and economic and political exploitation, and you can think about Jesus. Okay? And being saved and the afterlife and all of those other things. So build the schools. Okay? Religious instruction is parlayed in the same way, okay, that it was when the Portuguese and the Spanish were doing it. Okay, convert everybody. So we've got labor, cheap and available labor, virtually slave labor. Okay, everybody else is complaining, about children working 14 hours. Oh, well, that's okay. We won't use those children. We'll find some new children. Okay. Complaining about the heat and working conditions and lack of concern about workplace accidents and things like that. No worries. We got millions and millions of people, disposable people that we can exploit now. Okay. What else? What's the third thing? We already talked about that. What's the third thing that this new outreach is going to provide? Markets for finished products. Right? Anybody know why Gandhi made his own clothes? Because the British absolutely destroyed whatever native textile industry existed in India. And they did it in a variety of other places too. Okay? It was his silent protest to the fact that he had absolutely eliminated the native industry because the British could flood and literally control the marketplace so that nobody else could buy anything except buy from Britain. Okay? You got command over that market. Okay? So all the finished products are going to go there. You don't have to worry about any barriers to being able to get those goods. Okay, it was just as bad in places like Egypt. All right, Egypt had the Nile River basin. It's one of the most fertile and most predictable pieces of real estate on earth, where peasants had been able to carve out, small farmers were able to carve out a living and had been doing it since the freaking days of the pharaohs. And then all of a sudden the British and the French businessmen come in as Egypt's leadership wants to modernize and say, hey, you ought to be able to put all this territory together and create large estate agriculture so that you can start creating profit off of it. And ended up displacing all of those Egyptian peasants and forcing them to become rural laborers on lands that for like 55,000 generations they had been working. Okay? So that's other stuff that's going down. Okay, so let's take a look and see how the nut cracked. Oh, there's also this unbelievable, I'll just kind of duplicate it on the board here a little bit. It's looking at inequality. It's looking at the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. Okay? And if you were to look at average income, if you went to someplace like Great Britain, okay, or if you were looking at the rest of continental Europe, and if you were looking at the so-called third world, like Africa, Asia, and Latin, Central and South America, if you were to look at 1700, this is where they all started. This would be the average income, roughly, I don't know what the numbers were, like 300 something annually. Okay? At some point to 1970, this was the map actually. This is the income rate for Latin America, Africa, and Asia. This is the income rate for European and other Western states, and this is the income rate for Britain. Okay? And the totals disparity between these groups, the advanced, so-called first, second world, or whatever, and the third, was something like 3,000% difference in average income. 3,000 times more concentration of wealth between those groups. That all occurred in the space of 200 years. And that's one of the things that they're talking about. Okay? So you're going to hear a lot of stuff, especially on Friday, of all the advocates for imperialism that are talking about how they're bringing civilization to the people that didn't have civilization. That's also what they brought. Okay? Anyway, let's take a look at this stuff. No soup for you. What does that mean? Any Seinfeld fans in the house?
I get the reference.
All right. Okay. So, the Seinfeld episode, this is one of maybe, if you ever rate Seinfeld episodes, this is one of like the all-time top 5 Seinfeld episodes. And so you had the group, Jerry and Kramer and Elaine and George, and they get wind that there's this great soup stand, somewhere in Manhattan. And they hear about it. And they're like, oh my God, the soup is amazing, but the owner is kind of peculiar. Okay? And they call him the soup Nazi. And supposedly it is, you'll get soup, but you have to follow some very, very rigid guidelines if you're going to be able to get access to the soup. You don't talk while you're in line. Okay? If there is enough space inside the door, then everybody else waits outside. But that door doesn't open. It opens and it shuts, and it does so politely. And then you go down the soup stand, you point to the soup that you want, okay, you quietly move over to the cash register, you have your money out so that you can hand it to the person that is taking your money. You receive your change or not receive your change. You get your brown bag that has your soup. You basically say thank you and you get out the door. No small talk. No, what am I going to choose? I don't really like tomato. I've got kind of like dietary constraints. It's the basil, it kind of gets in my system. You can't do any of that stuff. If that happens, the soup Nazi looks at you and says, no soup for you. And you can get banned from ever getting soup there again. Okay? But everybody wants the soup. Everybody's willing to put up with all of the crap because the soup is so good. That is China. Okay? That is China. Think about it. Think about the potential marketplace that China offers. Even in the early days, the sheer population, the sheer advanced society, the society that had been around for 5,000 years, the opportunities that were available for trade. Okay, it was limitless, and everybody knew it. So the very first people that took a crack at it are our OGs here: Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, and others. Okay, and when the Chinese looked at these folks like they were heathens. You know, China, had a printing press like 1,000 years before everybody else. Okay, they had silks, and they had ivories, and they had porcelains, and they had advanced government, and a variety of other things. And their cities were beautiful. And these Portuguese traders show up at their shores, and they're like, "Would you like a pickle?" And their Chinese are like, "Man, dude, did you shower? Anything like that? No." All right. And so they kind of took it like, "All right, well, if you wait here, all right, we'll see if anybody wants pickles or whatever the hell you guys got. We'll give you some silks and ivories. You can take it back. You'll be a big freaking hero in Lisbon or whatever." Okay, and so there was a trade relationship, but it was very, very, regulated. Okay, then the Portuguese were there for a while, and then they started getting cocky. And then their Christian missionaries started to run around, and they got their way into the interior, and they're trying to flip a whole bunch of Chinese people into becoming Catholics. And they got really pissed off about it. They were changing the rules. They were talking in line. All right? They were undecided about the soup that they wanted. And the Chinese looked at them and said, "Out. Out you go." And everybody else, for that matter. They gave them one port that they could more or less access out of. Okay? They couldn't leave that port. Any trading that was going to be done was going to be highly regulated and highly controlled for the next 300 years. All right? And that's how it stayed. Okay, from the 1500s up until the early 1800s, China has virtually nothing to do with the West, other than a small pinch of trade that exists between some of the European traders out of this port, Canton. All right, up until that point. Japan, very similar stories. Okay, early on, the Portuguese were involved in like gun trading that was going on during some of the Japanese military conflicts. And then by the early 1600s, this group called the Tokugawa shogunate took over. And the Tokugawa shogunate way freaking ahead of the curve. They had an enlightenment before Europe had an enlightenment. Okay, and they were going through all these transformations, but they too looked at some of these folks, these Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish traders, with active disdain, and basically says, "Y'all need to stay on the sidelines." So even though China had regulated contact, there was some times when Japan had absolutely no contact.
Was that like 300 years or something?
Huh? For about 200 years. Tokugawa's, or roughly the early 1600s. And then by the time we fast forward, it's about 1850. Okay, yeah.
The Tokugawa shogunate, weren't they super militaristic, and wasn't it kind of like an oligarchy?
It was.
Yeah.
Okay, it was very feudal. I mean, that was the point.
Yeah.
It was very, very much fit like a military feudal type of regime. Okay? So anyway, no soup for you for both of those regions for a very long time. But then it's kind of like, okay, the lights are out. There's very little connection between the East and the West. China and Japan wanted it that way. The Europeans probably didn't, but okay, no soup for them. Meanwhile, though, what happens in that time period? Scientific revolution. Enlightenment, agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, political revolutions. When they come back, they're unrecognizable. And that's the point where we've seen the Portuguese yielded to the Dutch, who yielded to the French, who yielded to the British. And by the time we get back to our story, the British have industrialized, they're looking for markets, and they're also looking at China and say, "Man, that's a freaking prize. We got to figure out a way to get in there." And they found it. What was it? It's a nice transition. They had taken over, more or less, the British East India Company had taken over India around 1763-ish, okay, when they had fought all those wars. French and Indian War, King George's War, when they were fighting for all of the cool places to be in global trade. They dominated India, and then they started dominating the poppy fields. And then they started to produce opium. And they found out the Chinese had a taste for it. Okay? Yeah.
Since they couldn't really trade with them, they gave them opium in the hopes that they would be more willing to trade.
It was a very, very kind of unregulated trade. It's the same kind of stuff that you could put regulations on the slave trade, but the slaves were still making it to the shores. Make no mistake, the opium was making it through. It was making it through the gaps or whatever the case may be. And not only that, but the Chinese, like precious metal, their gold supply started to dwindle. And it ended up being transferred into British coffers in exchange for the fact that the Chinese had even more desire to get their hands on opium. Okay. Then they started to notice that there was an epidemic. People were addicted. Okay. Folks weren't doing well. And that's the point where some of the political leadership in China said, yo, how is this happening? Who's doing this? I mean, obviously on the supply end, somebody's hooking our people on opium. And they all point, all roads point to the British. So they send a letter. It's one of the documents, because you guys will have a PSD that you can do between now and next week. I'll probably assign it tomorrow. But one of them is this letter from basically like a foreign minister. Name is Lin Sisu. It's spelled Zexu. All right, and sends this open letter to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is pretty much queen at the height of British power, 1837 to 1901. So, nice formal letter to the Queen, just said, hey, thought you might like to know how things are going here. All our people are addicted to opium. This is a moral problem. You guys are the culprits. I thought as a respectable person, you might want to know what your merchants do in your name. Maybe you can curtail the problem. Silence from Queen Victoria and her camp. So the opium trade continues. All right, and word gets back to the highest reaches of the government, and they're like, well, so what? Did Queen Victoria reply? Or is there going to be any kind of like formulaic regulation on Britain's part? And they're like, I don't think so. So the Chinese said, well, we'll put it in our own hands then. And they started to send some ships out to capture these British merchant ships, and then they started to set fire to their opium supply on the docks. And the British were like, oh no, the British are burning our ship, or the Chinese are burning our ships. And then they're high-fiving each other. Because they're like, thank God, we got them to basically start a war with us. And that war's not going to go well, folks, because Britain has an advanced industrialized navy. China had fallen into similar paths as Russia and the Ottoman Empire and others where as feudal regimes they were dominant. But society had modernized, it had industrialized. China did not roll with the changes. Britain rolled like crazy to the changes. And so that wasn't a fair fight. Britain's navy versus China's navy was not a fair fight. They called these the Opium Wars. They were fought it was 1839 to 1842 was the first one, and then 1856 to 58 was the second one. Who wins? Britain does. And they sign a period, they call these the period of unequal treaties, because basically they were demands that Britain made on China that China had to accept. Okay? So the first one, which was called the Treaty of Nanking, that's where Britain got Hong Kong and had it for like 99 years. And then once everybody else started to smell it, it's like, wait a second. No soup for you just gave out a whole ton of soup. Okay? And Britain's just walking away with a cache of soup. And then the French, Germans, Russians, everybody starts like showing up with their like soup suits on. Saying with their ladles, saying, come on man, hook us up. They knew something was wrong. And that's the truth. The fact of the matter is that there was internal struggles that were going on in China. We'll talk about it. Okay? But the same stuff we were talking about with Russia, they had a pants drop moment. Okay, when Napoleon and Napoleon's forces invaded Russia, it was sort of a recognition, or reckoning, if you will, that Russia was behind. They needed to reform. They needed to make some changes, or they were going to get rolled. China was going through some of those same paces. Okay? Intellectuals in China that were like, well, how do we do it? Do we modernize? Do we try to become more like Britain and France? Or do we have to respect Chinese traditions and kind of do it on our own pace? And there's a lot of dialogue, but not a lot is happening. Okay? And then you remember, you have those periods where you have, just like on the eve of the French Revolution, where you have a top-heavy aristocracy with a whole bunch of privilege and a whole bunch of land ownership and a lot of destitute peasants. And it just so happens that in the middle of these two Opium Wars, there was a major civil war that broke out in China. Okay? That was led by this figure that supposedly had converted to Christianity. His name was Hung Shu Xuan. That figured out that somehow in his readings of the holy books that he was Jesus' brother. Okay? And so Jesus' brother is going to lead this massive peasant uprising against the Mandarin aristocracy and all those military elites. And it engages in like this 14-year civil war. And the death tolls were measured at somewhere between 20 and 30 dead peasants. Okay, by the time it was all said and done. That internal struggle is only exacerbating all of these coyotes or hyenas on the grasslands, if you will, that were looking to pick China apart externally. And that's something that they were going to have to deal with. The second treaty that ended the Second Opium War in 1858 then gives privileges to Christian missionaries. They're back in the interior. Traders were allowed into the interior. Russia and the United States got a whole bunch of trade port access and a bunch of other privileges. And then the one that hurt the most was called extraterritoriality. Does anybody know what that term is legally? Any idea? It means that if there is a European that commits a crime, by any standard of Chinese law, Chinese can't prosecute the crime. They have to be sent back to home country in order to receive their punishment. Which virtually means that Europe is above the law. They can do whatever they want. And China knew it, but that's essentially what ended up happening. So then you hear about, rapes and atrocities and a variety of other things that are committed against Chinese people while this relationship exists. Okay? But that's what's happening. That's how China got carved, if you will. And it doesn't stop. It's going to go on and on and on up until like the lead up to World War I. This is only the beginning of a whole series of events that are going to get China picked apart. Almost to the point where the U.S. Secretary of State's going to have to step in and say, whoa, before everybody starts like ripping China into a whole bunch of like sovereign territories like they did Africa, we need to come up with a different plan. Okay, that's called the Open Door Treaty, but we'll get to it. All right, so Japan. Easy story. I mentioned before, no soup for you. All right, so that goes on for a couple hundred years. This time, rather than the British, it's the U.S. The guy's name is Commodore Perry. Y'all familiar with this story? So Commodore Perry shows up, and he's got some boats and stuff. He's like, hey, Japan, trade with us. And Japan's like, Westerners? So yeah, we're from the United States of America. It's like, what is that? Territory out west. Got our independence a while back. We're up and comer. And Japan's like, yeah, hey, good for you guys. No soup for you. So Commodore Perry's kind of look at him and gets into that like Italian conciliatory kind of place. This is going to be very disappointing to my boss, And then so they return the ships back home, and they come back a few months later. This time they've got gunboats with their guns trained on Edo Harbor, basically saying, trade with us. Japan's looking over the guns and saying, yeah, all right, let's do it. All right. That's about as paraphrased as I can get, but that's how Japan was opened up to trade, was just the threat. Okay, and the recognition that once again another Western society that had gone through some element of industrialization, not on the same level of Britain, but certainly on a level that feudal Japan was not at, that pried their markets open. Okay? So that's a different tact. So 1, hook them on opium, provoke a war. 2, threaten to fight them. Okay? 3, this one's a little bit more, it's a little sexier. Okay, so this is in Egypt. Okay? And Egypt is in a region that is part of the like what ultimately was the big reach of the Ottoman Empire along the Asia Minor basin, among other things. And they, like in the late 1600s, early 1700s, into the late 1700s, started to develop nationalism. Started to develop an identity that said we're not part of a multinational empire, we need to be our own thing. And maybe like the beginnings of that started, or the stirrings of that began in Egypt, but then it really got accentuated as Napoleon and other people started getting introduced. That's that Napoleonic code on the road stuff that I was talking about. So, after all of that, Egypt is kind of in this spot. You're watching the Greek independence movement, and you're watching Balkan nationalism, and there's uprisings in Syria, and there's uprisings in the Arab Peninsula. And Egypt's like, this is our time to kind of carve something out for ourselves. So their principal governors, or whatever you want to call them, are starting to gesture more and more that they want to just be Egyptians on their own right, and not necessarily vassals to anybody. Unfortunately, the people that they looked to help them get to that point in development were France and Britain, but Britain especially. Okay. Anybody help me with pronunciation? Mehemet. Mehmet. Mehmet. Muhammad Ali. All right. He's the one that kind of begins this process. He wanted to build Egypt into like something that if you went to Western Europe, you could say, damn, that's pretty sweet. Alexandria, Cairo. We want them to look like Paris and London. So we're bringing Western investors in to help us with building. Architectural building, rebuilding the city, paving the roads, building an agricultural base, building hospitals, building bridges, whatever. And the bankers and investors obliged. They're like, how much you need, baby? Let me write you a check. Okay? And those checks just kept coming. And the spending just kept happening. And after Ali followed his son, Khedive Ismail. Khedive is like Dauphin for Egypt. Okay? And Ishmael is even more like enamored with Western ways. You guys remember my Zinga Miemba story? You remember the guy, like the Ethiopian king that was like, yo man, I love being Catholic and I love everything Portuguese, baby. Like, I want to be Portuguese. And they're like, okay, we'll build you a church, you can worship there. Oh, we're also going to like capture your family and sell them into slavery. And before you know what happens, we're going to bum rush you. All right, and that's what happened. Okay, same thing's going to happen to Egypt. The longer and the more dependent they become on Western investment, the more dependent they're going to become, and then after a while, it's almost like, you're a drug addict, and you got a dealer, and that dealer is going to give you a nice taste first couple times around, and then after a while, it's going to be like, yeah, I'd love to give you another hit, but you're going to have to do some things for me. All right, and that's what ended up happening in Egypt, is that the Egyptian leadership, the British and the French, were kind of like, oh, yo, we'd be happy to float you another loan, but I know that you want to build this Suez Canal. I think that you're going to have to provide us a whole bunch of shares. The other thing is that your next round of political leadership, we get to appoint it, because we want to make sure that our business interests are met. Okay, and that's that story that I was telling you about how they screwed up a 5,000-year social economic arrangement around the Nile River Basin, tried to turn it into corporate or estate agriculture, and ended up displacing a whole bunch of peasants. And by the time everybody got wind of it, it was very clear that the lower classes were suffering. All right, and then a very small concentration of like pro-Western rich emerged in Egypt, and there was a massive inequality between those two groups. And the Egyptians were looking for a way out and saying, you guys have become pawns. Okay? So they formed a nationalist group and said, we got to get rid of this Western influence. We need to take back Egypt for the Egyptians or whatever. And then there was a fight. And so now Britain's like, oh, you want to fight, do you? And their advanced industrialized army and navy fought against Egyptian nationalists, and the same thing that was going to happen in India ended up happening in Egypt, where instead of them hiding behind Egyptian leadership and pretending that Egyptians were really running their own country, they said, well, let's stop with all the appearances. Let's just occupy the country. And so after the 1879 to 82 uprising, Egypt becomes a military colony of the British, and they send their own general in to run the country. His name was Evelyn Baring, alias Lord Cromer. And then you could use Egypt as a base of operations to start moving further south. Okay, and then they did that. Okay, but that was a huge get. But you could watch it. It's a very, very sinister thing that they did. They literally loaned money out to the point that they had become so dependent that they could then use that as a springboard for a political takeover. Okay? There was a whole bunch of different methods. Okay? And that's one of the things that you can keep in mind. But the most powerful states, the most powerful fights that they were going to face to an absolute onslaught against non-European states were in places that were very, very established, like China and Japan, and they didn't stand a chance. So imagine what it's going to be like for an average African country. Okay. So tomorrow what we're going to do is we're going to look at some maps. And you can actually see this is where they went, here were some of the key people, and that sort of thing. But they called it the scramble for Africa. It was very, very sad. In the space of about 15 or 20 years, it's like somebody fired a starter's pistol and they just ran around and just occupied the whole continent. All right. And like I said, some of the worst atrocities that their exhibition season for 20th century genocide was imperialism. That's where they learned things like concentration camps and death camps and a whole bunch of other things. Okay. Let's see what else we got here. I think that covers it. So what we do tomorrow, if you would listen just real quick, there's a section called Global Migration, and that means like Europeans are going to other places. So we're going to look at who's leaving, where are they going, why are they going, that sort of thing. Then we'll do the map stuff, which starts on page 802. Says Western Imperialism 1880 to 1914. Talks about the scramble for Africa and some of that stuff. And that will take us to 807. So if you can read up to there, that would be good for tomorrow. There's even a biography on Cecil Rhodes in there, who's a key figure in this story. And then Friday we're going to do like essay-oriented things like causes and motives for new imperialism, and then also an essay called Critics and Advocates of Imperialism. Like who's speaking out on behalf of the imperialists. Has anybody ever heard of White Man's Burden?
Yeah.
Yes.
The Rudyard Kipling poem?
Mm-hmm.
Has anybody heard of Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness? Okay, so there is definitely some advocates, and there's definitely some critics. Yeah.
Is it bad that I love that book?
I guess the answer to that would be why. Joan, are you here?
Yep.
Stop time, please.
Beautiful prose.
It's an excellent book, but I'm reading one now that literally traced